Hi, I'm Sheila Kuehl with about 1/3 of my voice, but fortunately it's the best third. And this is Get Used to It, which is a monthly gay and lesbian issues discussion show. I'm sure that you've been waiting, since this is our 5th show, to see just when we were going to get around to the issue of lesbians and gays in the military. Well, you're in luck. That's what this show is about. And I'm very fortunate to have a distinguished panel of people to discuss the issue, as well as several people. For the first time, we're actually going to have an audience, and several people in the audience who are also prepared to talk to us about how they feel about this issue and what they think. Let me introduce our panel. First, here on my left is the Reverend Dr. Dusty Pruitt, whose precedent-setting case in the 9th Circuit established in federal law that it is a violation of our right to equal protection when discrimination is done against us by the military, and also established in law that social prejudice alone was not sufficient as a defense for the military. The Supreme Court refused to hear the case, and so it's good law in the 9th Circuit. Welcome, Dusty.
Thank you.
And thank you for doing that. My next guest, Bill Meredith, who's on the board of the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, and also on the Board of Governors of the Black Gay and Lesbian Leadership Forum. Welcome, Bill. Our third guest, David Mixner, who is, I suppose by his own description, an unofficial, yet I think important advisor to President Bill Clinton, and one of several co-chairs of the new campaign for military service. Welcome, David. Glad you're here. Well, here we are. We all have a lot to say about this. Let me start with you, Dusty. What do you think, in terms of your own experience, what have you sort of learned from going through this case, and what would you like the people out there in cable land to know about it?
Well, my aim has always been to effect an end to this policy. Since I was young and in the military, I saw a great deal of pain and a number of lives ruined as a result of this policy. I myself had to live under the policy, and did for some time, suppressing a great deal of creative energy, looking over my shoulder, wondering when somebody was going to turn me in or accuse me of being a lesbian. And I said to myself, if I ever get a chance to bring this policy down, I'm going to do it. And I got that chance about 10 years ago when I gave an interview to the Los Angeles Times and inadvertently was outed. I mentioned to the woman that I was had been in the military, was still in the Army Reserves, even though I was pastoring the Metropolitan Community Church of Long Beach as a full-time job. The Reserves was the part-time job. And she printed that. To my surprise, she printed it, but the resulting furor over that resulted in an ACLU lawsuit, which is still going on to this day.
What was your history in the military?
I was in the active duty 5 years and was a trainer. I taught nuclear, biological, and chemical defense. And thank God not offense, but at any rate, that was a critical skill. And when I was in the reserves, I was placed in the individual ready reserves, which is a list of folks that have critical skills. It would have been a nice skill to have in the Gulf War, as if you can recall seeing the pictures of all the folks with their masks on.
Why do you think there's all this outcry, not just now, but forever? Of course, there's more of an outcry now because we're more public. But why all this homophobia in the military?
Well, I think the military is the good old boys club, and they had problems with anybody who wasn't quite like the white patriarchal male. They had problems with blacks and other people of color, and certainly the language to prohibit them is close to the same kind of language that they used to prohibit gay men and lesbians. And they really had problems placing women in full use, and still are having problems with women in combat. So racism, sexism, homophobia, all birds of the same stick, so to speak, birds of a feather flock together.
Right. Well, we know that there are a lot of lesbians and gays in the military, and always have been. What's your experience in terms of the reaction of straight people in the military when they know?
After about 4 years in the military, I had enough of this not telling the truth. I was not raised in that way. I was raised in a very religious home, and tell the truth was something that I'd learned as a part of myself. And finally, I told the truth to my executive officer, who's a second in command. And his attitude, he had asked me out actually, and I told him I didn't want to go out, that I was sick of being asked out by guys, that I really didn't want to go out with men, that I was a lesbian. And his answer was, oh, gee, you know, I didn't know. If I'd have known, I wouldn't have asked you out. And that was basically the attitude of the other folks that I got more and more bold to tell. And certainly whenever I was in the reserves, I was working for a church, that Christian church, with an outreach to primarily gay men and lesbians. And when I'd go on my 2 weeks active duty, people would ask me what I did, and I'd tell them, and there was never a problem. But what I didn't realize was that when Reagan went in, he tightened the regulation and made it mandatory for discharge in 1982. And that was what had got me investigated and ultimately discharged.
The church has applied to be, I'm not exactly sure how this works, but to have pastors in the service, right? Or
Right.
chaplains.
Chaplains. The Metropolitan Community Churches would like to place a chaplain. We're very small, probably would not qualify for more than 1 or 2 slots. But that's also raised quite a ruckus. We've had some problems even being admitted to the National Council of Churches, even though they've ruled that we have all the qualifications for joining, that we are Christian and so forth. They sort of confessed that their own homophobia was a problem to the unity of the structure itself, so they wouldn't even let us be official observers. So anywhere we go where we think that we qualify, we apply, and we think that we qualify. I certainly have the qualifications to be an Army chaplain, and I'd like to be one.
Well, I hope it works out. That'll
Thanks.
be really interesting.
Thanks.
Your history is going to be interesting no matter what you do. Bill, when we were talking earlier, you were telling me a little bit about your family history.
My dad was in the Army. My perspective on gays in the military is a little different. I was gay in the military, but I wasn't really a military member. 40 years ago, more than 40 years ago, I guess, when my dad was originally enlisted in the Army, it was a segregated Army. And he went through the entire process of going from a segregated Army into a quasi-integrated Army into a very kind of racist institution. And I think one of the things that we talked about was the whole idea of homophobia and racism in the military, and are they one, are they similar, are they different? I don't think racism is exclusive to any community, including the gay community. I think that for the most part what we're seeing from an African-American point of view, and probably other people of color, as well as poor whites, is an economic issue here as it relates to the military. Many of the people in the military these days, it's a last resort for them. I mean, it wasn't their first choice to go. As a result, they should have the options that are open to everybody else that goes. I spent 6 years of my life in foreign countries, where I was treated a lot better than I was when I returned to this country as a military child. So it was a very interesting kind of growing up. And I know there are a lot of people out there whose families were either in the Navy or the Army or the Air Force who grew up like I did in a very sheltered, closeted environment. And there weren't a lot of mentors around in the general community to talk to gays and lesbians about coming out and being open. And in the military community growing up there, it was even more baffling and even more shut down and even more tragic for a lot of people. Many suicides and many kind of behaviors that led to alcoholism and drug abuse.
It's interesting that it's discrimination that creates a kind of funnel for poor men and women to think of the service as their best option. I don't mean to insult the service in any way, but that it becomes a way that it's your best choice, which I think is a very concerted effort to do that. When I was in Vietnam with the USO 1969, we were required to count the number of people we talked to because the Army paid the USO per military person that we talked to. So I know that I talked to 10,000 men. And I was taken with how much larger a percentage of men of color there were than in the general society, even in California, that I had come from, and also the enormous number of poor white men from the South mostly, and poor Northeast states. So I think they make it like your most viable option. So I guess if you're poor and you're gay or lesbian, and you see that as a great option, then you really, you don't feel you have much of a choice, and if you have to remain closeted, then that's what you have to do.
And for many, I think, African American people of color, poor whites in the military, we talk about a corporate glass ceiling. I think there's a camouflage ceiling in the military that relates specifically to how far people can go. And that's an unfortunate aspect. And sometimes I feel like I'm in the wrong body. I remember the Vietnam War trying to get people out of the Army. Now here I am trying to get people in the Army. It's amazing transformation, and the irony's not lost on me at all.
Yeah, I know it is. It's sort of amazing when we're going like, we really want to get our people into the military, and I'm going like, I don't know if I really want to.
Well, that's another issue, and it has to do with the economics of it. I mean, in some, Marjorie Hill, who works for Mayor Dinkins in New York, said a couple of weeks ago at the Black Gay and Lesbian Leadership Forum conference in Long Beach that we really should be looking at dissolving the military rather than enforcing it and making it stronger by adding people of color and lesbians and gays. But of course that's not going to happen in my lifetime, and probably not in some of the viewers' lifetime. But what we can do is make a military that's a little bit more open. I mean, we've got to remember going back to the Revolutionary War and the Prussian Baron, what was his name, Van Steuben, who was gay. And the only reason that he agreed to Benjamin Franklin's edict to come and help out in staging the Continental War in Valley Forge was because the ecclesiastical people were after him because he was gay. And what did he do? He showed up with a 17-year-old who was supposed to be a French interpreter. But as Randy Schultz says, you know, obviously his skills were in something other than language. So we've been around for a very, very long time in the military. My mom, on this issue the past few weeks as it's been unfolding and exploding around us, mentioned to me, I don't know why everybody's so concerned or upset about gays in the military. She said there were gays in the military when your father and I got married. She said some of our best friends in Germany were gay. She said they've been there, they've been protected and loved the whole time. And she said a lot of the reasons I think that we're hearing this has to tie in with the overall civil rights movement as it relates to lesbians and gays and where we are and the voice and the vision that's being provided now by a new leader, as well as the vision and the work in the neighborhood that's going on behalf of us advancing. So.
Well, speaking of our new leader, David, sort of in the middle of the griddle now, aren't you? I'm happy you're in Los Angeles today. We know you've been in Washington a lot. You know, there's been a lot of ambivalence about what President Clinton did, and I'd be interested to hear your view on it.
Well, you should understand, President Clinton has some ambivalence about what he did. I mean, President Clinton wanted to sign the executive order immediately. That was his desire, that was his wish, and that was his commitment to us during the campaign. We always don't have control of events, and certainly when it comes to homophobia, racism, and so forth, logic and rational thought is not a trademark of those institutions. I mean, after all, we had a governor of Alabama stand in a schoolhouse door to stop a little girl from getting an education. That's not rational, you know. And what happened is Colin Powell and Sam Nunn really riled people up, got them very upset, and mobilized our opposition. In 1 week in the U.S. Capitol, there were over 500,000 phone calls, letters, and telegrams opposing lifting the ban. Senator Nunn came into the White House and said, if you sign that executive order, we will vote on it immediately in the Senate to overturn it. We did a quick vote count with the Senate leadership, and the vote was 80-20 against us. We didn't even have enough votes to sustain a veto. Now, there were those in the Clinton administration who still wanted the president to sign it, and saying we will have filled our commitment.
Right, it gets him off the hook. He says, I did the right thing.
And this
Senate
issue will be gone, and they can't provide the votes to sustain the veto. Sign it, get it behind us, move on with economics. You know, it's the economy stupid type routine. And then there were those of us who said, we'll get you the 51 votes if you give us 6 months. You know, we'll get it. Our community will deliver those 51 votes if you give us the 6 months.
There's a lot of concern, though, about what's going to happen in those 6 months. I mean, in essence, it's like, I mean, you know, I've been out for a long time. I've heard a lot of homophobic remarks, though I've been very lucky not to be, you know, beaten or seriously hurt. But even I feel personally sad. I feel depressed when I now hear people feeling permission to say these homophobic things, and I'm imagining these hearings are going to be a nightmare.
Well, actually, I think the hearings in the end are going to be pretty fair, because we're putting the kind of hearing team together of some of the best and brightest gay, lesbian, and non-gay minds in Washington, D.C., all of them who are offering their services pro bono, and we're in tough negotiations with Senator Nunn that are going very well right now, and the Senate leadership. Senator Kennedy's responding. But I want to say something, Sheila. You know, it is a period that we probably inevitably have to go through if we're going to want our freedom. You see, if we're quiet and we don't make noise, and if we hold steady and don't shake up the boat, no one's going to say those things. We're not going to be visible and as we say, stay in our place. But the moment we become visible and the moment we demand equality under the Constitution of the United States, the battle has begun. Now, it's a battle we have all sought. It wasn't the ground we chose. It wasn't our timing to choose it. But is one we have looked forward to for a vote in the Senate of the United States on our freedom, which is the only place we can obtain it. You know, I would have much rather fought that battle on the Civil Rights Bill than on the military issue. We weren't given that choice. The choice was very clear. Issued executive order, voted out, and we would be set back years. Try to go through what is going to be a very difficult and painful 6 months in an enormous struggle for the hearts and minds of the American people about our freedom, and get those 51 votes. Now, I believe that we have as good and as talented people to hold Sam Nunn steady at these military hearings. We'll take him on one for one. They might have the Joint Chief of Staffs, but we have Dusty Pruitt and Tracy Thorne and Margaret Hannemeyer, who's going to knock the socks off the people of this country when they know their story. You know, and we're going to be successful. And the March on Washington is extremely important. Everybody who believes in this cause of freedom must be in Washington, D.C.
On April 25th.
On April 25th. It is absolutely crucial that they see us by the hundreds of thousands, not intimidated, not in fear, and that they're not going to keep us silent, no matter what. President Clinton is going to issue an executive order shortly after July 15th. It's going to be tough, it's going to be uncompromising, and it's going to be the order we originally wanted. And then we will have a vote. Sam Nunn has promised us. He's sort of our George Wallace, you know, in the Senate of the United States, somewhere between July 15th and August 15th. And it will be the most historical and important vote in the history of this community.
Well, I see the rough hand of the right, of course, in a lot of this, too. I mean, I think that all of the generation of phone calls and letters, and we're pretty organized. I mean, I think every national organization, National Lesbian and Gay Organization, is in the consortium around the campaign, as I understand it.
There's a good news and bad news. I mean, no, there's good news and good news. I'm sorry. The good news is that we're now equaling their phone calls and letters. It's running 50-50 now. And we don't have television stations that we can flash our 800 number on immediately as soon as something happens. But all of our groups all over the country, and our people got on the phone and mailed those letters, and now we're running 50-50, and I think we're going to pass them shortly. And I think the other good news is that for the first time in the history that I can remember of this community, every national organization that I know of has joined together in a campaign coalition to last only the duration until the vote takes place, pooling the resources, pooling the talent, a common strategy, recognizing the historical significance and the importance of this vote.
Now, is the civil rights community seem to be with us, too, outside the gay and lesbian national organizations?
The NAACP this weekend for the first time endorsed both lifting the ban and endorsed the March on Washington, which is the first national civil rights group. The Civil Rights Coalition in Congress is part of the broad coalition called Campaign for Military Service. I'm like Phil. I sort of want a T-shirt that says "Pacifist for Military Service." You know?
Also, I think that it's kind of been late in coming, the participation of the civil rights groups, because there was no one entity to kind of address the broad issue of what we're doing in the military. But I also need to remind the audience that this is the culmination of a lot of work of a lot of years for a lot of people. I mean, National Gay Rights Advocates, and a name that seems to have kind of fallen off the mountaintop here is Perry Watkins, and the work that the National Gay Rights Advocates did with him on his behalf, and then later Lambda Legal, which they won. I think that it's important to remember that National Gay and Lesbian Task Force has for 5 years had a military project. And so what's happening is you're getting the wonderful expertise of the task force coupled with other organizations in Washington coming behind this campaign. which is a very, very fundamental and useful campaign now, which will then lead us, it's hoped, to a very successful battle again for our federal civil rights.
Well, that kind of community organizing has been kind of long in coming for us, and yet we've also had some movements to learn from, to look at, and we've all participated in a number of other movements before we suddenly could bring all the expertise to this one.
The other issue is you can't count the churches out. One of the things that we've done locally as well as nationally with the Metropolitan Community Churches is make coalition with those churches who believe that homophobia is a sin. And there are Christian people who believe that the issue of righteousness for gay men and lesbians, justice for gay men and lesbians, is a civil rights issue, and passionately believe that and work hard to believe that. And it is a divisive issue in the church, but the fact is that there are numbers of people on that side.
You know, it's important to understand, I mean, I go to Capitol Hill, and I've been traveling all over the country for the campaign for military service, organizing people to prepare for this vote. And every question I go, especially by the local press, is what is the homosexual agenda? Like, I don't know, let me see, where is it here?
Well, they've seen the tape, that's why.
And I say, we do have an agenda. We do have an agenda. I said, I fess up. I admit we have an agenda. And that is, we want the same protection under the Constitution of the United States that's given to every other American citizen, no more, no less. And that includes the ability to serve our country with dignity and honor and not have to lie and not have to live in fear for the right to serve our country.
Well, it's interesting, all the movements, I mean, what you said, Bill, about the experience of your father and racism and segregated forces, and I know that Strom Thurmond used the same language about blacks in the military. And I've long thought that one of the reasons for the terror, allegedly, of straight men in the military about gay men especially being out, is that they know how terribly they treat women. And the only way they can think about sexuality is this taking power over, the tailhook scandal stuff, right? And all of a sudden they think, oh my God, I'm going to be treated that way, which isn't the case, because gay men could
Sexual harassment is a fact of life in the military. It was a fact of life for me as a lesbian. In fact, I think I said that was the reason that I came out, was I was sick to death of sexual harassment and being continually bombarded by offers to go to bed with these guys.
We do have a behavioral problem in the military, and it's heterosexual behavior.
That's right.
So having a code of behavior would be a good thing.
Well, if I were at the tailhook scandal, one of those guys there, and I was looking around at my behavior, and I thought about what we are supposed to do, lesbians and gays, I would be kind of afraid too. I mean, that was just outlandish. Well, lawsuits are coming from it. Right. One of the things, though, that I think that we need to remember, and something that Randy says in his upcoming book, Conduct on Becoming, which I think is going to be issued in St. Martin's Press in April of this year, is that the battle is only going to start, really, once the executive order is signed. Right. The work that we're doing now, just like all of the work that was done to get the president in the White House that we have there now, is only a call to action by all of us who need to work harder once we get an ear. Getting an ear is one thing, but it's another to sit back and be complacent. I think we're going to be really, really bombarded from the Christian right and what Fran Lebowitz calls the religious right, the Christian left, once a ban is issued, because that's going to give everybody free rein, pall mall, to say and do whatever it is that they want to do. And Conduct, I think, on Becoming is a wonderful, wonderful title for his new book, and it's interviews with 1,100 lesbians and gays across the country. Okay,
we need to take a break now. We'll come back. I'm going to talk to some people in the audience, and don't forget what you were going to say. And don't you go away either.
Hey, faggot, come here, I want to talk to you.
Hey, I don't want any trouble.
You got a problem, faggot?
I'm not gonna fight you.
Oh, yeah?
Hi, and welcome back to Get Used to It. In this part of the show, we're going to talk to 3 veterans who are here in our audience and ask them to tell you their stories and anything else they want to say. Joe Tomasini, welcome.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for being here today.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I thought I'd come down and lend support to the panel. First of all, I greatly admire Dusty for what she's been going through. And I also felt that I needed to come out and talk about my story. I spent 13 years in the United States Marine Corps, at which time there was an allegation of homosexuality. And I spent 2 years of living hell, going through the board and trying to survive their little test just to be boarded out on an incident and not an actual homosexual allegation or charge.
How long were you in the service?
I spent 13 years in. The allegation came up after 11 years in, and it took 2 years of the Board of Inquiry for them to come back and decide that due to an incident, a single incident, that I was unfit for duty.
How did it feel to be in the closet all that time?
It was rough. I, especially during the board, the 2 years, fought like hell to sit there and say I was not gay, which really went against my inner feelings. But at the same time, I knew that talking to my close friends and watching and observing the troops that not only I led, but I've had other friends as commanders for, there was a growing acceptance of the homosexual population that was there. There was no homophobic fear that I hear right now. The chiefs of staff come out and spread this rumor and this tape about what life is going to be like. And it's not what I saw for the 13 years that I was there.
So there were guys that you served with that knew you were gay?
Oh, yes.
And you didn't feel great hostility from them?
No, not at all. Matter of fact, the greatest support for those 2 years came from those people that, as this quieted case was shuffled through the military justice system, we're finding out, both my superiors, my peers, and my subordinates, they all came to my support, because what I did with my personal life in no way affected them and their job or what their mission was.
Well, you must have felt really, really terrible in going through this. Really, you've been in the service for 11 years, you've done your best.
You have a feeling of being alone, even though there's people there lending the moral support to you. There's that sense of being out there alone, because you really, especially at that mark, 11 years looking at retiring at 20 or 13 years looking at retirement at 20, you're fighting for your survival, for your life. You've just given the military 11 of your best years, 13 of your best years, and now it's all going to be cut off just because of a lifestyle or an orientation that you happen to subscribe to.
So it's really a big waste to the military, really.
It is. The people that I served with and that I watched get drummed out of the military for homosexuality were basically some of the best and finest military peoples and minds that I've ever served with.
Joe, thank you for telling your story.
Oh, thank you.
Alicia Martinez.
Hi.
Thank you for being here.
Well, I'm glad to be here. I'm really glad to be here. It's something I think that we all support, obviously everyone in the audience and all three of our panelists. My name is Eliseo Martinez. I was a sergeant in the United States Marine Corps. I'm presently a director for client services and personnel for the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. I enjoyed the Marine Corps when I was there. I know a lot of people, it's not made for everybody, I realize that, but I really enjoyed it. I had a situation during my career where one of my men information was bad-mouthing, maybe I shouldn't say this, but I'm going to say it, faggots, and he was going on and on and on with some other derisive language. And finally, I heard that there was a ruckus. I was inside, I came out, and I approached the private, and I asked him what was his problem. And the question I asked him was, I asked him, in fact, was he gay? And he looked at me and he said, well, Sergeant, you know I'm not gay. I said, well, what's your problem then? Just because this guy touched you, it's not contagious. Nothing's going to happen to you. Are you really having a problem with your relationships with women for now? You think it's going to inhibit yourself? And he said, well, no, I don't think that way, Sergeant. So I really laid the law down to him, and I told him his behavior was unbecoming that of a Marine. Well, later on, my commanding officer called me in and wanted to know what had happened. And I explained to him, and afterwards he looked at me and asked me if he could ask me a personal question. And I said, yes, sir. And he asked me if I was gay. And I said, sir, yes, I am. And his response was, well, you're doing a good job, Marine. I think the way my men behaved after that, because I was in charge of, I was in intelligence with an infantry unit, my men were real supportive, and in fact, a couple of them came out and said, Sarge, I'm also gay, but I don't feel like I can come out right now. A lot of, as has been recently has been mentioned in this show, a lot of other men in my platoon too came out and said, you know, we really support what you're doing, and you're a good sergeant, so that's really the only issue. That's all we want. We have to get back to conduct. There are rules of conduct in the military, and that's all we want to be treated. We just want to be held to the same standards of conduct as everyone else.
As a matter of fact, when what we were talking about and the way women are treated, we'd be real grateful if people were held to those kind of standards of conduct.
Right. Certainly this issue is the things that we've seen about the gay bashings by personnel in the military is a failure of leadership from the top down, in my opinion. When the Joint Chiefs of Staff say that only they don't condone it, but privately they're saying, but we understand how you feel, and we're not going to let them in either, that's a tacit message all the way down the line that says that it is okay to bash gays. Whereas this sergeant here was saying it isn't okay, and I'm sure you didn't have any further problems, did you?
Well, no. In fact, I was real fortunate because I had, obviously I had a real conscientious CO. I mean, we could all go on nightmares of other individuals who were not so fortunate. But it's true, it really is a leadership issue here, and that vacuum needs to be filled. Yes. Because I also see this as a generational problem, because women in the military that's not the issue. The insecurity doesn't seem to lie with women. The issue right here, I think, is really being brought to not only by the right wing, but by older officers and men, because I had a lot of my enlisted men, a lot of the younger officers, I said there was no problem with that. Mm-hmm. You know, we've been there, we've performed successfully, and many times I would venture to say that we were better sailors, Navy people, Air Force people, and Marines than the average service person, because of the fear that somebody, as Dusty touched upon, somebody can come up behind you and, for the simple reason of being gay, ask you to be booted out or get you booted out, no matter how exemplary your record is. That has to be changed.
Well, this whole thing about this morale problem, I mean,
Well, one of the things that's recently been reported out of the Gulf War, and there were a lot of instances of support there, was in a recent Newsweek article, and it stated that in the protective clothing that the guys had on and the women had on from the poisonous gases and the potential of any sort of gas bombing, they really couldn't feel each other unless they went like that. And there's a story of one gay Army enlisted man who was out to the other 4 or 5 people in his foxhole. I mean, they totally knew he was out. And what's touching about it is at night when they slept, they all had to sleep like this, and there was nothing ever said. They did not touch him because they did not touch him because he was a gay man. What happened was that they fraternalized and they became more and bonded in one, which is all we're kind of saying here, is that regardless of who you are, regardless of how you serve, I mean, the Army itself is very guilty, the military is very, very guilty of double standards. When there is a war, they tend to relook at who they have disinducted out of the Army.
That's right.
During the Second World War, they were looking at reinducting gay men who had been put out of the Army because they were gay if they had not done any public homosexual offenses. So, I mean, the double standard has been there from the very beginning, and it's who you listen to and what side of the fence you want to sit on. And all we're saying is, let's get rid of the fence and let's all sit together.
And hopefully the hearings will bear that out, because there's all kinds of other stories about guys on the same platoon in Nam who were gay, and it came out that they were gay. But back there, you were one fighting unit, and you didn't care about what the guy did in bed. You just cared about whether he was there to support you when you needed it. And I think that that's going to be borne out, because it's also been talked about, Frederick von Steuben. Well, here's a guy, we're always reminded that of negative things from the Founding Fathers and other things in the military. Well, here's a guy who was probably the second most responsible person for winning the Revolutionary War, whose ideas brought forth the military academy, and whose ideas, in fact, were inscribed in a book which served for 30 to 35 years as the book for order and discipline in the military. I want to tell David that, you know, we'll take you up on the challenge. We're going to be in D.C., and it really is. We are going to tell the president that he needs to move on this. He really needs to move on this, because we still consider him a friend. But I also need to tell President Clinton that he also needs to forcefully send the word to those people who killed that Navy individual that that is unacceptable, and we will prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law. And that what's happening to people outside bars of North Carolina is unacceptable, and that if people don't want to be in the military or don't want to serve under the commander-in-chief, they should get out.
Absolutely.
That's right.
Absolutely. I just one.
Alicia, thank you.
David,
go ahead.
We should remember that 10% underneath the headstones in Arlington Cemetery, 10% of the people who lie under those headstones are lesbians and gays.
That's right.
And we have died for our country like anyone else.
You know, also I was thinking in World War II, I remember they used to say there are no atheists in foxholes. And I would think there's probably no homophobes really in foxholes. The question is, you know, are you there and doing your job?
Yeah.
Well, Narit Shine has an interesting story. And I was thinking when Bill was saying it's sort of like when we've always been in the military, and when they need us, they call us back in, this notion of necessity, and I know your story relates to that. Tell us a little about yourself.
Yes, well, my name is Nurit Shine, and I'm a retired lieutenant colonel in the Israeli Army, and I am currently the director of programs for the Gay and Lesbian Community Services Center of Los Angeles.
I bet they obey you over there.
Well, there is a little bit of that. My story is rather different because I come from an army that you have to go in when you are 18. It's not a matter of choice, it's a matter of you have to. And there is no ban on homosexuality in the Israeli army. And I need to separate two issues, the homophobia and the performance of the army. We all know the reputation of the Israeli army. We're regarded as one of the best armies in the world, and I can vouch for that. And gays and lesbians have been serving in the army since 1948 with the start of the State of Israel. And the homophobia that goes with trying to put the performance of the army on having gays and lesbians not serve in the army, that is a whole separate issue. And I think that we also have in Israel. I think the American army, as far as I know, also performs with gays and lesbians the same way it would without gays and lesbians. So I don't think the question is of performance. The question is really, truly of homophobia. And what you said, David, really strikes a chord with me, because before I received this rank of lieutenant colonel, which is one down from the highest rank a woman can be in the Israeli army, I felt it my duty to my community, first of all, to go to my commanding officer and tell him, look, I am a lesbian, and you need to know that. What he said to me was, first of all, I know, because it was fairly common knowledge, and he said, you were an excellent officer a week ago, you're going to be a good officer next week, I don't see any problem. And that was basically the beginning and the end of that. So I really had a good experience in the Israeli army. I served for many years. I have never heard of anybody being discharged because of homosexuality.
But Narit, there is homophobia in the army, right?
Oh.
I mean, you told me when we were talking, there are a number of people who really don't want to come out, are afraid to come out.
Most people.
Partly the society itself. I mean, the Israeli
Right.
society itself is homophobic.
Right. The Israeli army is a mirror of Israeli society, and Israeli society is a homophobic society. Judaism places the priority on family, on procreation, if you take orthodoxy, and the situation that we are in is such a situation that obviously family life and having a family and having children is right out there in the most important thing that we can do. So therefore, homophobia is something that we have to deal with. Most lesbians and gay people in the army are closeted, unfortunately.
But not because they think they're going to be kicked out of the army, because they don't want their folks to know.
Exactly, exactly. They won't be kicked out of the army.
Right.
But exactly for the reason that society will not tolerate it. It's not a question of performance, it's a question of the culture. And the more visible we are, the better it will become. And it is changing, and it's changing in Israel too. There were some laws passed in the last few years. There is some uproar in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, in the last few months. And it is changing. And I think much of it is changing because of what is going on here in the United States. So I think we in Israel have a lot to learn from American society as regard to tolerance. And America can learn a little bit from us in not being afraid to lift a ban for something that is truly unnecessary.
Great. Thank you very much. All right, we're going to take one more break, and then we'll come back and talk to anybody in the audience that wants to talk. So we'll see you in a minute.
Here's one time it doesn't matter who your neighbor is. here's the other. Life's too short. Stop the hate.
Hi, welcome back to Get Used to It. Today our topic is lesbians and gays in the military. Topical A. Now we're going to go to the audience and see what they'd like to say to our guests and to you. Anybody in the audience want to say anything? Yes, Joe.
Hi, this is basically for David. I agree with the earlier statement that was addressed as that the issue is not a performance issue, it's a homophobic issue. However, with Mr. Clinton, the president, backing off on the signing of the executive order, it has given our opponents the chance to build up a very strong case, and I know for a fact that's what they're doing, is they're building it on performance. They're also building it on fear, they're building it on moral charges. As for our approach, without tipping our hand too much, I'm joined with the Lesbian and Gay Community Coalition here in Los Angeles on the Grassroots Committee in going and establishing our stance, and we want to talk about performance. And what is the national level actually doing? What are they pulling in? Who are they pulling in? Or can we even contact you and talk to you off camera?
First of all, I want to say President Clinton has not backed off the executive order. He will sign the executive order. He was presented the choice to sign it and lose it forever, or give us 6 months to get 51 votes. And I don't want us to lose sight that we have to get 51 votes, and which he is helping us do, by the way, in working Congress. I would suggest you contact the Campaign for Military Service in Washington, D.C. Hy Feldman is doing the policy and preparing for the hearings, along with a gentleman named Gregory Craig. There will be two strategies. One, to present to the nation in the hearings, which I think basically will be people like the three of you who spoke. I mean, there is nothing more powerful than personal stories. Then we will target approximately 10 states where there is a large number of undecided senators, 2 in Tennessee, 2 in North Dakota, 1 in South Dakota, 2 in Nevada, 1 in Florida. And we will tailor those messages compared to what our focus groups tell us will be the most effective message to take to the people. But for example, I would imagine that some of the media spots that we will run in the more Midwestern states, or a state like Nevada, is we have a Gold Star mother who lost her son in Desert Storm, who told her that he was gay just before he left. And I think we'll put her on camera. We have located a World War II non-gay veteran whose life was saved by a gay man who died saving his life, you know. And I don't think there's anything more powerful than we have than the individual stories. I mean, I sat here and listened to the three of you, and I was very, very moved. And I think the nation would be too if they hear you.
My name is Patricia Ryan, and I'm the co-chair of the Lesbian and Gay Advisory Council for the City of West Hollywood. And I have a substantive issue I'd like to discuss, but first I have to plug something. We in the city are part of a coalition of organizations and groups that is forged, and we are meeting weekly to discuss what we can do to help, and we obviously think money is a big portion of that and funneling it up to the national level. We're having a town hall meeting here in the city, March the 25th, on Thursday, in the West Hollywood Auditorium at 7 o'clock. We are co-sponsoring it with the Human Rights Campaign Fund, and we hope and we ask that everybody please come, bring your friends, bring issues, and discuss this with us. The substantive issue I have is I don't understand where this fear comes from in the military. It seems to me that they equate homosexuality with sex, and that really irritates me because it's not what I'm about as a person, and I don't think it's what anybody here in this room is about as a person. And my sarcastic response to that is, don't flatter yourself. We obviously have taste, and we're not indiscriminating. So I don't understand what that's all about, and I was hoping maybe you could enlighten me just a little bit.
From the standpoint of singling out a particular identity, sex is most easily identified with the lesbian and gay community because that's how we interpret it. I mean, what we do is supposedly to some a sexual deviation from the norm. But it's no different really than, it's different, it's the same category, but when you look at people walk into a room, and if their skin happens to be black or yellow or brown, you immediately target them, and you have in your mind, excuse me, a set criteria of what you think when you see that person. And I don't think it's any different than that for so many people who live in this country and in other countries. When they hear gays and lesbians in the military, our identity with them is sex. or sexual,
Right.
or has some innuendo.
Stereotyping as Bill is saying, is one thing, but the other thing is that minorities and people of color and women all sort of serve as a watershed for the things that the dominant culture cannot handle in themselves. And this country is not very good at handling their sexuality, period. So they have funneled their anxieties about sexuality off on black men, off on other people of color, off on women, and now off on gay men and lesbians.
You know, I think there's something else involved, though, and that is that throughout history, it seems that one of the most effective ways to repress a community is to repress its sexuality. You make it illegal. Whether it was people of color who weren't allowed to marry, who weren't allowed then, when they were allowed to marry each other, they weren't allowed to marry us, and now, of course, we're not allowed to marry. And that's a way of controlling, theoretically, the legitimizing of sexuality, and also this notion of using sexuality as power. If you delegitimize everyone else's sexuality, it makes yours very powerful.
That's right.
And you make it secret, too.
I think one of the most important points, where does it come from? It comes from the leadership. I mean, I think we've heard from the testimony of the lesbian and gay veterans today that their peers were very comfortable with them being gay and lesbian. And that it was, what we're seeing is it coming from the Joint Chief of Staff, the head of the Armed Forces Committee, Sam Nunn, who is using the fear and the misunderstanding about our community for his own political means, to build a political career. I mean, it's known as an old-fashioned bigot from where I come from. That's right. You know, and that's what he is. He's a good old-fashioned bigot trying to use our constitutional rights to advance his political career.
Thank you. I wanted to tell you that at the end of the show, we're going to give you the phone number for the White House and for Congress. And we really, really want you to use it, in addition to calling your national organizations, and we'll tell you about that too. Who's next? I saw your hand up. Stand right up here. Tell us who you are.
I'm Ruth Waters, co-chair currently, soon to step down, of the Black, Gay, and Lesbian Leadership Forum. I would say that I would hope that many of your listeners who have never had to deal with discrimination, except as they chose to, would learn from this and let us all get out and do the same old-fashioned kind of thing that we did in the early 60s and back in the 40s and forevermore, to garner support in the broader community and get all those people out of the closet and give them the strength to come out, and their parents and their sisters and their brothers, their whole family, because there is not a family in this country, I don't believe, who does not have one of us among them. So if we get everybody strong enough and let them know that we're going to be there for them, we might make some differences, even in our own communities.
Well, this is now don't go away now, Ruth. This is a question of coalition, I think, that you're talking about. First of all, when you say people who've never been discriminated against unless they chose it, you mean people who are in the closet, mostly white people, because people of color would be discriminated against whether they're gay or straight.
That's right.
And so I know it was interesting when we, flying back to the march a couple of years ago, there was a couple of guys on the plane that were talking about how excited they were because they'd never been to a march before. And it was like 1990, you know, or 1991, and I thought, who in this country has never been on a march? But it's true. I mean, every movement sort of has its moment, and this is an interesting coalition that we can build. And you're talking just plain old-fashioned community organizing, really.
That's true. And, you know, I have often said that we in the lesbian and gay community have the opportunity, since we are a small cosmos of the larger community, to show what real Americanism is and can be if we do it.
And we shouldn't.
And this is a marvelous opportunity for us to start, where the majority of the community does not call on us at the last minute when they need us, when they don't practice de facto segregation, as sometimes some of our gay and lesbian cities do. Many things like that, where we can really become true American community and show the world what it's like.
It's really more than building bridges, isn't it? It's kind of walking across them, too.
Hey, you got it.
Yeah.
Sheila, I was just going to say, too, that a lot of the coalition building that we see now, and trying to bring in different elements that Ruth so eloquently, you know, put together, is also a fact that going back maybe 10 years to at the beginning of the AIDS crisis, we had a group of men who were white, who were privileged, who had never suffered, who had never known discrimination for the most part. And this is a generalization, but it's pretty much fact. And what we saw with AIDS was that these people of privilege, were immediately being discriminated against because of a condition which was medical. And it spurred them to some sort of action. And during the whole genesis of the AIDS movement and now going into the military movement and the gay rights movement, I think what we see, we are a generation, for the most part, apart from some of the people who are in ACT UP and the other groups, which have provided wonderful leadership at the grassroots level in terms of spurring and coalition building. And I don't want to see that end. But what I do want to talk about too is during the 10 years that AIDS has been going on, the federal government has spent $500 million getting rid of gays and lesbians in the military. And I think that that's disgraceful.
Well, you know, it's interesting too. I was very glad actually to see the activism and the anger of some of the men who had never felt discrimination before, mostly because they've been in the closet, because the outrage of the privileged is enormous when they're discriminated against. And it became a kind of an interesting, powerful weapon, because the rest of us who've been discriminated against all our lives are sometimes a little timid about feeling or expressing that outrage. We're not given permission to do that, but white men are given permission.
And they have checkbooks.
And they have checkbooks. Bless their checkbooks, too.
That's right.
One of the interesting things I'm finding when I travel around the country is that another whole group is joining our tribe, is joining our community, veterans. And group after group I go to, people are coming up, and it's like people who march for the first time. This is the first time they've written a check for a gay or lesbian cause. This is the first time they've been to an event for a lesbian and gay community. And they're veterans, and they're coming up, many of them for World War II and Korea. And they're writing checks, and they're going to go to Washington for their first march. And so we are adding another whole element to our tribe, to our community, which is very exciting to see.
Great, more people. Yes.
I'm Jonathan Pruitt, also with the Black Gay and Lesbian Leadership Forum. I think I have a comment more than I have a question, because I think what has happened with this campaign for military service is that it is trying to be a grassroots movement. It's trying to invite the many communities that have not necessarily been a part of the leadership and organizing and to bring them on board. But clearly the campaign for military service was organized by a core group of people who are within themselves very selective. And then all of a sudden out of that, then they're trying to invite everybody else along. And that's very hard to do and take part and ownership for a process that you were never a part of in the beginning. So all of a sudden now it's like, well, you come along and jump on band, but the bus is already taken out, it's already out of the gate, you know. So we want to jump on board after the fact. And sometimes it's a very distasteful taste in people's mouths because they're never a part of the organization. And what I'm hoping this campaign does, if anything else, besides making groups stronger, also reminds us that our community is broader than just white gay men. And that if in fact we're going to be about the business of being a good community, we're going to bring those people along from the beginning and not afterwards. So.
Thanks, Jonathan.
We can build coalition. One of the things that we've been working at in the Metropolitan Community Churches for years is building coalition with all the other civil rights organizations to try to talk with them. Bill and I were talking earlier about there's a problem in the black community because they're very fundamentalist, and so they see homosexuality as a biblical issue. So they're like morally opposed to gay people and threatened somehow by the fact that we might want to join the civil rights movement. But when we talk their same language as persons of the cloth, so to speak, we can bring them along when we begin to talk about issues of discrimination and finding justice in the land and being able to, people of color's issues are our issues, because if one person is discriminated against, we're all discriminated against.
Yes, privilege doesn't know color. It does, but when you look at the civil rights leaders and the ones that actually forged that bond in the 60s, got to the historic signing in 68, and we look at now who is the Joint Chiefs of Staffs and their attitude, it became kind of a power brokerage firm among those civil rights leaders, and David's talked about this at length, and how those people have now become establishment. And so they are protecting what they believe are their vested interest to the exclusion of other African Americans who now face a different sort of civil rights struggle. And it's important to keep all of this in focus as all of us in this room collectively. I mean, there's one of everything in here, which is the way it should be.
Hey, this is movement, right? I mean, this is movement.
It is.
This is the struggle that, you know, the civil rights movement. I mean, it's interesting. The African American movement is known as the civil rights movement.
And always will be.
And always will be. David.
You know, I think one of the things that we've always got to keep in mind, and I couldn't agree with your point more, and as we all learn from each other as we go along, we're a very diverse community from all economic levels, from all races, creeds, religions, and the whole works. But one of the things I learned from my years in the movement, when I say, oh gosh, why can't we just all agree and why can't we just all be together? And then I realized that part of the excitement of who we are is our diversity, and is who we represent, and that we come from so many walks of life in a common struggle and a common cause, and that we all grow by being in the same room with each other. And that, you know, I remember in the 1963 Civil Rights March, it wasn't sure that Dr. King was going to go on in the afternoon because they wouldn't allow John Lewis to speak. And there were huge fights backstage behind the scenes, whether John Lewis of SNCC, who wouldn't sign a pledge of nonviolence, would be allowed to speak at the March on Washington. Every movement has its diversity and has its...
So parting the waters is about.
Exactly.
It's a fascinating one.
Exactly.
We've only got about 30 seconds left, so what I'd like to do is very much thank our panel, distinguished panel. Would you like to thank them too? Thank you. And I'd like to thank the audience and apologize to those of you I didn't get to, because we're just about out of time, and I want you to look at these phone numbers at the end of this tape. I want you to call the White House, tell them how you feel about this. I want you to call your Congress people, both the House of Representatives and Senate side. I want you to call the national organizations, participate locally, and tell everybody, get used to it. See you on the next show.